For 16 months now, Russian occupiers still haven't managed to capture Pokrovsk, even though they've deployed what is probably the largest number of their troops there compared to other directions. First of all, why is the city of Pokrovsk so incredibly important to the relentless Russian occupiers, and why do they truly spare absolutely no one, literally sending their own Russian soldiers to relentlessly storm this crucial area?
Nothing new? That's why Putin, the entire political leadership of the Russian Federation and the so-called Rashid Federation need some kind of foothold, some kind of show of success to demonstrate that they are achieving something somewhere and winning somewhere. And for these negotiation processes, in order to have some trump cards in negotiations, they are now focusing their efforts specifically on the Pokrovsk direction, as you correctly said. 16 months and losing a huge number of personnel and equipment, and without such success, they can't even claim things like Putin's visits. They've already invited journalists to Pokrovsk. They've tried everything. That's why, as of today, and I'm sure in the future as well, the tasks assigned to the armed forces of Ukraine and to other defense units involved are being carried out and will continue to be carried out. The main objective is not a building, a structure, or a settlement. It is to destroy the enemy, to wear down the enemy, and to preserve the lives of our servicemen, to protect the lives of civilians who, unfortunately, are in the area of military operations. And in a broader sense, they sometimes interfere with accomplishing the tasks set before us. So everything is fine? In this regard, things are fine, though it is difficult. The enemy, as you correctly said, has thrown its largest grouping toward the Pokrovsk direction today and continues to send reinforcements. But they have not achieved the success they would like to have. And those fleeting successes, the very small ones they do actually have, are often ambiguous, constantly shifting, and there simply isn't a truly clear line of demarcation on this particular section of the front.
Sergei, we also saw two massive and devastating attacks on the capital city of Kyiv this week. One of them has already been called a record in terms of the number of strike assets used. But here, in the context of what's happening at the front, I want to point out that despite the fact that the occupiers have indeed amassed a huge number of personnel and equipment, and our positions are being stormed constantly, Ukraine is defending itself. But by and large, Putin has nothing to boast about. All he can do is tell tall tales on propaganda channels. And these attacks on the rear, on infrastructure, on civilians, would you say that this is precisely a reflection of Putin's failures at the front and that he's trying to influence the situation in this way?
Perhaps they were actually aiming somewhere else as one possibility, but this is not the first time they have shelled residential neighborhoods, hitting apartment buildings, and well, this is their method, a terrorist tactic of intimidation. But I'll say this, addressing not only the citizens of the Russian Federation, but also those who press the buttons and launch these missiles and shaheds. We will definitely find all of you sooner or later, no matter how long it takes. You will be held accountable. Before the law, under the laws of wartime, no matter how much time passes after pressing that button. Such actions are not forgiven, according to all norms of international law as well. They need to be reminded of this so they never forget. They won't be able to change their names. Nowadays, there are plenty of ways and means to track them, and even more will appear in the future. You see, I've spoken with many people from Kiev, and today I called people in Irpin and so on. On the contrary, people's attitudes, what's happening actually motivates people to pay more attention to supporting the armed forces of Ukraine, to be more attentive, to prepare for the fact that we have to endure and that we have no right to break. Because if we break, things will only get worse. This is a sign that today, within Russia itself, they are imprisoning people for more than 10 years just for some post on the internet or for expressing something against the authorities. And at the legislative level, they are passing such laws in the regions. But the absurdity just keeps getting worse and worse. This needs to be understood. We need to pay attention to this. We need to talk about it. We need to remind people and remember one thing. If you show weakness to the enemy, especially an enemy like the Russian Federation, then things will only get worse in the future.
So, Sergei, just as a military man and also an expert, I wanted to clarify with you. Today, we've already recalled that during World War II, Hitler also tried to influence Great Britain in this way when they bombed residential areas and civilian infrastructure as a whole. So, as I understand it, this is, let's say, a method, not exactly military action anymore, but if things aren't working out on the front, then they try to put pressure on the rear. Or is that what Putin is doing in this situation?
Well, Putin has simply lost his mind. That needs to be clearly understood. He is truly insane but realizing that the end is near, and right now it's actually in his interest to keep the war going, he's afraid. There are many aspects to what he's afraid of. He's afraid of his own so-called soldiers returning to Russian territory, those who have seen death, who have witnessed the injustice of how their commanders treat their subordinates. He understands that the elite, the so-called elite in quotes, his accomplices won't forgive him for this either, and when there's a war, well, it's a war even though they haven't officially declared it, but in reality the entire industry is already working for the war effort, on a military footing. This is what prolongs his life for some time. That's why we need to address his inner circle and tell them. They're used to calling it the Ukrainian conflict, or the conflict in Ukraine, as they say, but I say we need to resolve the conflict around Putin. The Putin conflict. Just think about how to resolve it, quietly, painlessly. And then perhaps they might blame everything entirely on him. We have made it absolutely and unequivocally clear, and we emphatically repeat, and society is firmly set on this crucial point. Any concessions or any surrender on Russia's terms are completely unacceptable to us. It's categorical despite the pain, fear, and so on. We will still fight for our independence. We will fight for our land. We will fight for our people, including the children they have stolen, taken away to their country, and are trying to raise in the spirit of their racist regime, distorting history, distorting the truth, and all that. This is what needs to be understood. That is why, in addition to the fact that today the civilized world, including the United States of America, Europe, and other countries, is actively are trying to help us and are looking for options, we need to think about how to solve the Putin problem. Once the Putin problem is resolved, it doesn't matter who comes to power next. They will have a chance to blame everything on the fact that decisions were made by a dictator, that he was the one at fault, and so on and so forth. And then, gradually, everything can be brought back to order, meaning paying reparations, returning territories, and much more.
Also, Sergei, if we talk about the situation at the front in general right now, the Russian Federation has chosen and is acting according to a strategy of attrition. They are throwing all their maximum forces, both in terms of equipment and personnel, at exhausting Ukraine's defense forces. In this context, considering that there are more Russians, that they have the resources to produce missiles, and after all, they do have missiles, and importantly, they also have partners who supply them with missiles. Iran, North Korea. To what extent can this factor also be pressured now by military means, considering that Ukrainian drones are overall changing the strategy of the war both at sea and on land?
Well, we don't just have drones anymore. We have a lot of other things as well. And it's important in this regard to say that we have something, and not to reveal exactly what it is, so they don't know how much of it we have, and so they only see the results. And here, in the context of that table you brought at the beginning of our conversation about the number of eliminated occupiers, equipment, and so on, today we could probably already start a table of losses on Russian territory itself, how many oil refineries have been destroyed, and so on. Transfer stations for pumping oil in ports, both for ships and cargo, tankers and so on. We can already talk about this as well, and it really is significant. And it cannot help but have an impact. Putin is puffing himself up, as you rightly said, just like Hitler did in 1945. He was waiting for help to come to him. He was waiting for them to launch that missile, the one that would defeat everyone and so on. And in reality, well, according to the legend, so to speak, or according to the truth that we know, he shot himself there in his bunker. Maybe it was something else. The most important thing is that he disappeared from the political map of the world and in general from any kind of life position. Most likely the same fate awaits Putin. It can't be any other way. Dictators never end differently. This needs to be understood, simply so that fewer people die on both sides. Yes, although calling those people It's hard to call occupiers who came to us with weapons people, but still. We simply need to resolve the Putin issue to deal with Putin himself. That's all, and I repeat, I want to emphasize this. This is not insignificant. It's a very important issue. That's it. Nothing else will matter. There will be a chance to end this sooner. Although, judging by all the current indicators, you can even look at analytics and count the number of assaults. They are wearing us down, but the Russian troops are actually very exhausted. They are exhausted both physically and morally. They have major problems with various diseases among their troops. They have issues with the fact that even in the 21st century, they still resort to executing their own subordinates, their so-called servicemen. They torture and execute them for any offense, not to mention extorting money, confiscating bank cards, and so on. There are already payment delays in the regions. Many regions simply no longer have the money to pay the families of the dead, the wounded, and so on. And all of this is the result of the work of Ukraine, Ukrainian society, and first and foremost, the armed forces of Ukraine, the defense forces, who are helping them reach this level faster. Well, plus the sanctions. And no matter what anyone says, the truth is on our side. We know it, and we will hold on to this truth. And above all, we are doing everything we can to speed up, to hasten that long-awaited word, victory. I don't want to say pobeda, specifically Paramoga, because for us it sounds different. And this is our word, and sooner or later we will definitely say it.
Sooner, of course, rather than later, but at this stage, unfortunately, we see that right now the situation is what it is. There is definitely a negotiation process underway, and a lot of different information is making its way into the information space as well. In particular, Putin, the dictator, and his propagandist Russian media are lying about the front line in Ukraine inevitably collapsing. Why is he doing this? Analysts from the American Institute for the Study of War are convinced that this is how Moscow is trying to force Kyiv and the West to agree to its political demands. But at the same time, Russia cannot achieve this by military means. Experts note that propaganda is spreading fake news about mass desertions from the Ukrainian Armed Forces, the collapse of the defense, and even an imminent offensive on Kyiv, according to these fakes. At the same time, artificial intelligence is often used. With its help, they create fake videos allegedly showing surrenders. And even so, even the so-called Russian war correspondents admit that the front is not collapsing and that Russia's successes are actually minimal and come with very heavy losses. Sergei, what do you think these messages that Putin is trying to, excuse my language, push in the West as well, how much are they resonating, or are people still guided by more objective information?
Well, it's quite possible, and maybe even more yes than no. Within Russia itself, this is actually well welcomed by those who watch their TV, their news, people like Solovyov, Skabeeva, and so on. So, well, they really do allocate a substantial amount of money for this particular endeavor, and there are a great many resources involved, constantly and meticulously creating some entirely fabricated things, diligently shooting numerous videos, and so on and so forth. We figured this out a long time ago. Our people just need to watch less of these Telegram channels, which is where most of this happens, although now they're everywhere, on TikTok, anywhere you look. That's why none of this works out for them. And the best way to counter this is to tell the truth as it is, as much as possible. So as of today, we know that the Marines have captured 19 Russian soldiers, Russian occupiers. At the same time, more than 50 were eliminated. This is the truth. They exist, we have their faces, we have their names, and this is what we need to talk about. This is where, let's say, we have an advantage over them. They are constantly lying. But we are not forced to lie. We tell the truth as much as possible, whatever can be said on air, because there are things we don't talk about. Out of anger, today they have resorted again to executing our prisoners, tied up, beaten, and all of it is filmed. Well, what is this brutality coming from? It's because they themselves live in such a society, you see? This really needs to be talked about. We shouldn't fall into any extremes, but simply hit them with facts. With facts, how Putin lives, how many years he's been in power, what he promised at the dawn of his presidency, his career, that as long as he is president, the retirement age will never be raised, and so on and so forth. What kind of inflation they're experiencing, how now they're officially announcing that People are declaring bankruptcy. They're really starting to have problems. That's why he keeps pushing, and at the same time, Putin tries to blackmail and set conditions saying, we're almost there, we're about to push through, we're about to capture, we're winning, and so on. And all of this is aimed at that dumb audience. At the same time, he sends his negotiators to the United States and tries to make a deal. He tries, as you rightly said, to push his proposals through by any means so that they get accepted. I sincerely wish you, dear and dedicated journalists of the truly wonderful Freedom Channel, many more successful broadcasts and for an even larger number of people to enthusiastically watch you in that important territory. I hope you have enough patience, endurance, and health for this, because your channel is being watched, but they don't understand the Ukrainian language. That's why it's important to speak Ukrainian to them correctly. That's why they watch you, they listen to you. And this is what needs to be explained to them even more. And we will still push through, we will win, and they will be ashamed. Even before the war, those imperial ambitions would slip through with them. It was constantly being shown on their television. Especially those who came to Crimea, they always believed that Crimea was their territory for some reason, and so on, because that's what they were taught from their school days. That's it. That Khrushchev gave Crimea away incorrectly, that it was his fault, and so on. The fact that the Ukrainian Socialist Republic, for example, revived Crimea, brought water there, and so on. They always keep quiet about anything that doesn't benefit them. They never talk about that. That's it. Everything will be fine. Putin is not eternal.